So we just got done talking in the previous slide deck about IT security policy and how we might develop IT security policy. But now we could talk about some frameworks. We're going to talk about two things in this slide deck. We're going to talk about frameworks first. Then we're just going to briefly talk about standard security architectures. The overarching theme of this slide deck is that these are standards that have already been developed that we can adopt within our organization. So we don't have to come up with an IT security policy from scratch. A lot of this stuff has already been developed that we can use. So some of the common frameworks that your book mentions, one is the Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology, or COBIT, which is very popular. There's the ISO series of standards for IT security policy. The National Institute of Standards and Technology also publishes various standards and policies. For example, SP 800.53, which is recommended security controls for federal information systems and organizations. So that would be used within the federal government. So the ISO framework, which is one of the frameworks, if you recall in the previous slide deck, when I talked about IT security frameworks, I talked about how you would have to come up with these various overarching areas of security policy, and I gave you just four basic examples. The ISO framework has 12 of those areas. It talks about risk management. It has a section for security policy, information security governance, asset management, HR, physical security, communication and operational security, access controls, acquisition and maintenance of and development of information systems, incident management, business continuity, and compliance. So that's a lot of stuff. So it pretty much covers almost everything that you might need in an organization that might be ISO compliant, which we'll talk about how to choose these different in just a second. Another example is the NIST framework. There are a lot more than 12. Here's an example of 12, but there are more areas of the NIST framework. So it's similar. It's a little bit more granular, these sections, but it's in the same vein. It's very similar to ISO. So this is a different framework that you could adopt or use as your basis to adopt the security policy framework within your own organization. So some of the other ones are COSO, or Committee on Sponsoring Organizations, COBIT, which I already discussed briefly, ISO, which we talked about. There are lots of different ISO standards that can apply to IT security or that have elements that apply to IT security policy. There's ITIL, or the IT Infrastructure Library, NIST, or FIPS SP 800. Many of you may be familiar with the term FIPS. It's the more common term for the NIST security policies. There's Octave from CERT and PCI DSS, which we discussed previously. So lots of security policy frameworks out there. How do we decide which ones we're going to implement in our own organization? So one way we might decide is by looking at what our industry requires. So certain industries have requirements to adopt different policy standards. So for example, if you're in the payment card industry, if you're accepting credit cards, if you're, and so forth and so on, or if you're HIPAA compliant, or you have to be HIPAA compliant because you're in healthcare or you're in the financial sector, so you might have to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley, FISMA, and so forth and so on. Audit firms usually have to comply with ISO, COSO, or COBIT, and then there's the industry standards. So for example, COSO might be a standard that you would adopt for financial controls. COBIT might be something you adopt if your organization is more concerned with IT controls, governance, and risk. ITIL would be more commonly adopted if you're an IT service management company or a company providing IT services or IT infrastructure services and so forth. PCI DSS would be a framework you would adopt if you have transaction processing systems. In many cases, organizations have all of these elements, so they might combine or use elements of all of these different security policies, all of these different frameworks, for example. In addition, there are other sources of IT security frameworks, which I haven't discussed here, CERT being one, or the Federal Agency Security Practices, International Association of Professional Security Consultants. So there's some alternative IT security policy frameworks, but they're not discussed in much detail in your textbook. So I won't discuss them in much detail here either. But there are certainly other examples. and even more beyond just those. So we're going to switch gears here for a minute. Um, we're also going to talk about, in addition to the IT security policy frameworks, there's also standards for security architecture. So when we're designing our security architecture, or if we're codifying our security architecture in policy, there are security frameworks already in place for those as well. Just to kind of reiterate here to review, you have management controls, which sets the direction and scope of security process and provide detailed instructions. Operational controls, which tell you how you're going to implement, and technical controls, which we discussed already. So, security architecture is sort of a standardized way to protect your IT infrastructure. So, for example, there's uh, two very basic security architecture concepts. We can get into much more detail here, but two very basic concepts are one, defense in depth, which is where we implement our security in layers, and it requires that organization establish multiple layers of security controls and safeguards. So you would, of course, codify that in your policies, and you would have technical support for those goals for defense in depth. But that is a very common security architecture to have multiple layers of security. We talk about that in this course, not only in this unit, but we'll talk about that in other units later on. There's also perimeter security, which is how to protect the border or the security of protecting internal systems from outside threats. The problem with security perimeter is it sort of ignores inside threats, which, as we talk about in this class, is very important. I always think when I think about security or perimeter security architectures, they're great. But if you remember from those old like 1990s horror films, when the girl takes the call and looks at the caller ID and realizes the call is coming from inside the house, right? It's always from inside the house where these threats are coming from. Not always, but you get the idea that it's something that we can't forget about. So, where the security architecture is protecting us from outside threats, our security policies are protecting us from the inside. So here is a graphic from your textbook which shows a standardized IT security framework. But this next slide is actually a little bit easier to follow. But basically, most security architectures call for a demilitarized zone, which protects some resources that are accessible to users outside our network, and it also protects our inside network from access from the outside of our network. So you kind of have this middle zone. We'll talk about these types of architectures in much more detail in Units 7 and 8 when we talk about network security devices. So in our next slide deck, we're going to talk about user acceptance and user awareness, and how we basically educate and train users about our IT security policies. So that'll be in the next slide deck.